The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs and tyrannize their teachers. These words, so they say, belong to the great Athenian philosopher Socrates. We learn from them that the youth of today have no manners, no respect for their parents and authorities in general. These lines have often been used to laugh at all those expressed concerns that the youth of any time are allegedly being corrupted and ill-mannered. Well, they probably were, according to the rules in force of their time. I remember when I was a kid that I had been told by the elders that the youth of my generation is no good. I also know that people of my generation today believe that the current youth doesn't look very promising. Even I catch myself thinking of it when watching those videos in which youngsters are making fools of themselves. However, I do believe that the youth of today have a lot of challenges, mostly because of the nature of the new technologies are consumed and used. They are affecting everyone's life. But in the end, meaning when they grow up, the youth of today will probably be okay. But as the words of Socrates show us, the youth always challenge the existing ethics, social norms and rules. The Remains of the Day from 1993 shows us this clash of the new and the old. Let's see what we can learn from this inevitable clash. Welcome to another episode of Film Magistery. The Remains of the Day from 1993 is marvelously directed by James Ivory, in my opinion one of the greatest American directors. It is an adaptation of the novel with the same name written by Kazuo Ishiguro. The film and the book have a lot of very interesting themes such as loyalty, social constraints, relationships, dignity, and traditions. However, while talking about the Remains of the Day, I will focus primarily on the subject of regrets and the clash of the old and the modern. In the center of the film stands Mr. Stevens, an English butler who serves at the Darlington Hall. Initially, in the 1930s and the 1940s, he serves Lord Darlington, but in the 1950s the place comes under the ownership of Mr. Faraday, an American politician and gentleman. Mr. Stevens is a very serious man, completely devoted to his job as a butler. The most important thing to him is the concept of dignity and professionalism. Showing feelings is, according to him, a display of weakness. We see often flashbacks as Mr. Stevens recalls his memories at the Darlington Hall during the late 1930s, so we see a wide range of people who worked at Darlington Hall. In the current time in the film, which is the 1950s, Stevens decides to take on a road trip to the West Country of England after getting a letter from Miss Kenton, the former housekeeper of Darlington Hall, who left the place 20 years ago to get married. Mr. Stevens gets a notion in the letter that Miss Kenton is not happily married and sees it as an opportunity to rectify some of his own personal mistakes from the past. You see, during the film we, the viewers, get a strong impression of the two characters who are, although strictly platonic and professional, very attached to each other and seem to have certain feelings for each other.
Are you reading a racy book?
Do you think racy books are to be found on his lordship's shelves?
What do I know? What is it? Let me see it. Let me see your book.
Please leave me alone, Miss Kenton.
Why won't you show me your book?
This is my private time. You're invading it.
Oh, is that so?
Yes.
I'm invading your private time, am I?
Yes.
What's in that book? Come on, let me see. Or are you protecting me? Is that what you're doing? Would I be shocked? Would it ruin my character? Let me see it. It's not scandalous at all. It's just a sentimental old love story.
Yes. I read these books, any books, to develop my command and knowledge of the English language. I read to further my education, Miss Kenton. I really must ask you, please, not to disturb the few moments I have to myself.
This is a quite painful scene to watch, mostly because it shows perfectly how Mr. Stevens confines his feelings between the thick wall of his facade. Miss Kenton is really pushing towards Mr. Stevens, but all he wants is to be left alone with his book. At least, that is what we see. However, we can sense that he is pained by his own facade that he puts in front of Miss Kenton, but nevertheless he cannot throw his mask away that he carries in all of his life. He is indeed his own prisoner, not allowed to express his true feelings. Throughout the film we see the flashbacks from the late 1930s when Lord Darlington had meetings with Nazi Germany's political representatives. For his strong seeking of the peace and understanding between Nazi Germany and the Great Britain right before the World War II, the locals saw him as a Nazi sympathizer and collaborator, which ultimately caused his social and personal decline. In the following scene we see the American politician Mr. Faraday address all the present attendees at the conference at Darlington Hall.
Lord Darlington. Lord Darlington. Lord Darlington is a classic English gentleman of the old school. Decent and honorable and well-meaning. So are all of you here, all decent and honorable and well-meaning gentlemen. It's been a pleasure and a privilege for me to visit with you here. But, now excuse me, I have to say this. You are, all of you, amateurs. And international affairs should never be run by gentlemen amateurs. Do you have any idea of what sort of a place the world is becoming all around you? The days when you could just act out of your noble instincts are over. Europe has become the arena of realpolitik, the politics of reality. If you like, real politics. And what you need is not gentlemen politicians, but real ones. You need professionals to run your affairs, or you're headed for disaster. So I propose a toast, gentlemen, to the professionals.
Mr. Stevens.
Well, I've no wish to enter into a quarrel on this our last evening together. But let me say this. What you describe as amateurism is what I think most of us here still prefer to call honor.
Concerning your father.
And I suggest that your professionalism means greed and power, rather than to see justice and goodness prevail in the world. I've never concealed from myself that what we were asking of Germany was a complete break from the tradition of this country. Thank you.
It is important to mention that Lord Darlington was not a Nazi sympathizer. He had a naive idea that it was possible to have peace with Hitler and his Nazi regime. He wanted to appease his German guests when they made their visit during the conference, so he did make some wrong decisions. However, later on, he did recognize that he made mistakes. So, apropos mistakes, let's talk about regrets. Some people make rash, hasty decisions which they later in their lives deeply regret. Many of us had tried to hurt other people, consciously or not. But in the case of Mr. Stevens, his biggest regret is that he didn't do enough to make most of his life. He was a very thorough butler who was respected by everyone around him, including Lord Darlington and Mr. Faraday. But he spent all of his life taking care of other people's businesses, while not doing anything for himself. All that mattered in his life was his professional career as a butler and keeping this cool and professional facial facade. There is nothing wrong with being a butler, but in the case of Mr. Stevens, being a butler is all of his character and his existence. He did care for reading and books. They gave him education, as he mentions it in the film, but he didn't give a chance to being loved by another human being. He didn't experience having children, watching them grow and pursue their own life goals later on. He was a great butler, and that is all that Mr. Stevens ever is and ever was. In the final sequence, we see Mr. Stevens and Miss Kenton waiting for the bus.
Mr. Stevens, don't you wait. That bus is always late. Come in out of the wet.
You must take good care of yourself, Mrs. Benn.
You too, Mr. Stevens. Promise me that.
Oh, yes, I promise. You must try to do all you can to make these years happy ones for yourself and for your husband. We may never meet again, Mrs. Benn. That is why I'm permitting myself to be so personal, if you will forgive me.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Oh, here it comes. It's on time for once.
And thank you so very much for coming. It was so very kind of you. It was so nice to see you again.
It was a pleasure to see you again, Mrs. Benn. Goodbye. Take care.
In this heartbreaking scene, Mr. Stevens even say that Miss Kenton must try to do all she can to make the rest of her years happy ones for herself and her husband. And when Miss Kenton enters the bus, we see her crying while looking at Mr. Stevens. The bus vanishes, and so does Miss Kenton out of Mr. Stevens's life. He goes back to his antiquated car and enters it. He ponders for a moment, and the second he realizes that he missed yet another chance in his life, the camera rolls to the lights of the car as he turns the car on. This is a powerful visual effect of someone realizing that his life could have been so much different, so much better. So all that Mr. Stevens has left is his memories of the past, which in the end are just the remains of the day. But did your own lights ever get turned on? Did your lives remind just a little bit of Mr. Stevens's? And do our jobs look even slightly as Mr. Stevens' job of doing stuff for someone else, while our own lives, our only currency that matters, and that is our time, ladies and gentlemen, is too easily being sold too cheap? Many of us are spending too much time at work and doing a lot of so-called pseudo work, while lying to ourselves that our job has a great and meaningful purpose. I know I can often and certainly identify with Mr. Stevens in this matter. So what to do? I guess it is in its place to end this episode just as we started it, with a few quotes by Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. There is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance.